A mother on a flight asks for nothing more than a glass of water for her children. But what happens next shocks everyone on board. A simple request turns into a confrontation that forces a flight attendant to be thrown off the plane. And the truth behind why it all happened will leave you questioning everything. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you find this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Nothing out of the ordinary. A black family, a mother and her 2 young children, boarded a plane headed from Atlanta to New York. After hours of waiting at the airport and another hour spent in the air, they were all feeling drained, ready to get to their destination. The children, restless and thirsty, began asking their mom for a drink. The mother, trying to stay calm and keep everything together, simply looked around and noticed the flight attendants walking down the aisle. She decided to ask for some water for her kids. A small request, one she assumed would be quickly granted. But when she spoke to the flight attendant, she was met with an unexpected response. The woman didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her request, and instead just nodded briefly without a word. It was odd, but the mother, trying to keep things simple, thought maybe she missed the request in the chaos of the busy flight. She asked again, this time a bit louder. "Excuse me, can we please have some water for the kids?" The flight attendant's eyes briefly met hers, but the response was colder than she expected. Without saying a word, the flight attendant just walked away, disappearing into the back of the plane. Confused and now growing more frustrated, the mother looked at her kids. They were still thirsty, still waiting, and she knew that a simple glass of water shouldn't be such a challenge. As the minutes passed, the discomfort began to settle in. Passengers around her started to notice the exchange, the awkwardness in the air. She felt the eyes of others, but no one spoke up. The flight attendant had walked past several times, but had yet to bring the water she had requested. Her kids were becoming more and more restless, the plane ride dragging on longer than it should have. She decided it was time to try again. "Excuse me," she said, standing up from her seat. "Can I please get some water for my children?" This time, the flight attendant paused, but only for a brief moment. Her eyes narrowed, and without any sign of empathy, she responded, "I'm busy right now." The words hit harder than she expected, leaving the mother stunned. She had been polite, respectful, and yet the flight attendant seemed uninterested, almost dismissive. The mother tried to stay calm, but this wasn't just about water anymore. She felt like she was being treated differently, in a way she couldn't fully explain but certainly felt. At this point, the mother's confusion started to turn into frustration. She couldn't understand why something so simple, a request for water, was being met with resistance. The kids, now growing even more uncomfortable, began to fidget in their seats. The flight attendant's dismissive behavior had already made the situation tense, and it was clear that something wasn't right. The mother sat back down, trying to reassure her children that everything was fine, but the discomfort was building in her chest. She glanced around the cabin, hoping to find a bit of understanding from the other passengers. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others seemed to sense the tension in the air. It felt as if no one was willing to speak up, no one willing to challenge the flight attendant. The mother took a deep breath. She wasn't going to give up. She got up again, carefully maneuvering her way through the aisle, making her way toward the flight attendant who was now talking to another passenger. She tried to keep her tone calm, even though she could feel the anger rising inside her. "Excuse me," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Could I please get some water for my children? They've been asking for a while now." The flight attendant turned to face her, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between them, like the tension had grown thick enough to fill the space. And then, in a voice colder than before, the flight attendant said, "I already told you I'm busy." She didn't even bother to offer an explanation or an apology. She just turned away, leaving the mother standing there, stunned, and now feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Some passengers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said a word. The mother felt a knot form in her stomach. She could tell that this wasn't just about water anymore. This was about something deeper. Something that was making her feel like she was being treated differently, unfairly. She could feel the judgment in the air, and she could see it in the eyes of the flight attendant. There was no excuse for this kind of treatment, and she wasn't going to let it slide. With determination, she walked back to her seat and took a deep breath. She knew she had to address this, but how? As the minutes ticked by, the discomfort in the air grew heavier. The mother's mind raced. She thought about all the times in her life when she'd been treated unfairly, the times when her requests had been ignored, and the moments when she'd been dismissed simply because of who she was. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about her children. She couldn't let this pass. They were thirsty, they were tired, and they deserved better than this. She looked around at the passengers, most of whom were busy with their own things, but a few had noticed the exchange. There was a middle-aged woman sitting 2 rows ahead who glanced over with a look of sympathy, but she didn't say anything. The mother's frustration started to shift into a kind of quiet anger. How could someone ignore a simple request like that? How could they treat her like she didn't matter? This was a basic need, something anyone would ask for on a long flight. But here she was, being made to feel as though she were asking for something outrageous. Determined, she got up once again, this time walking directly to the front of the plane where the senior flight attendant was. This was the woman in charge, the one who would have to do something about this. The mother's steps were firm, each one a signal of her frustration, her resolve. When she reached the front, she didn't hesitate. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice still calm but now laced with something sharper. "The flight attendant in the back refused to give my children water. She's ignored our request twice now." The senior flight attendant glanced at her, then glanced at the flight attendant still working the aisle. There was a noticeable shift in her demeanor, but she didn't say anything immediately. Instead, she turned to the younger attendant, her face hardening slightly. "I'll take care of it," she muttered before walking away. The mother waited, trying to keep her composure, but every second felt like an eternity. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down. As the senior flight attendant approached the back, the mother watched from the front of the plane. She saw the younger flight attendant turn toward her, but this time, there was no kindness in her eyes. Instead, there was something else. Irritation, maybe even anger. The tension was thick now, not just between the mother and the flight attendant, but in the entire cabin. Passengers started to sit up straighter in their seats, clearly sensing that something was happening. But nobody said anything. The air was charged, heavy with unspoken words. The mother could feel it all, the silent judgment, the growing frustration, and it only pushed her to stand her ground even more. And then, as the senior flight attendant turned away, the mother overheard something. It was a whisper, just low enough not to be immediately heard, but clear enough to make her blood run cold. The younger flight attendant muttered, "Not all requests are treated the same." The words hit her like a slap. Not all requests are treated the same. The mother stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Did she really just hear that? It felt like the air in the cabin had suddenly turned stale, thick with something that didn't sit right. She had been trying to keep her emotions in check, to stay calm for her kids, but that phrase, it was more than just a rude comment. It was a clear message, one that hit her in a way she couldn't ignore. Her heart started to pound. Was this about race? Was that why her simple request for water was being treated like an inconvenience? Was it because of who she was or the color of her skin that she was being dismissed so coldly? The more she thought about it, the more her anger grew, but so did her sense of disbelief. How could this happen in 2025? How could someone be treated this way for something as basic as asking for water? She turned back to her seat, trying to collect herself, but the weight of the situation was sinking in deeper by the second. The flight attendant's words kept echoing in her head, over and over again. Her children, still sitting quietly in their seats, hadn't fully understood what had been happening. They were just thirsty. But now the mother knew, without a doubt, that something wasn't right. Something bigger was at play here. And it wasn't just about water. It was about something that was going unnoticed by most people in that cabin. Something the flight attendant had said that, at the time, seemed like a passing comment, but it wasn't. A few passengers around her had started to murmur quietly among themselves. The mother glanced at them, looking for any sign of support, but they all quickly looked away as if hoping to avoid getting involved. One woman, who had seemed sympathetic earlier, caught her eye for a moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. But that was all. No one was stepping in, no one was speaking out, and that made the mother feel more alone than ever. She could feel the eyes of others on her, but no one was saying a word. It was as if the incident had become a silent test. Who would say something and who would stay quiet? The senior flight attendant returned shortly after, but she didn't address the situation right away. Instead, she moved past the mother without a glance, directing the younger flight attendant to another part of the plane. It was clear that the incident wasn't being handled with the seriousness it deserved. The tension in the cabin grew even more, like a storm on the horizon, just waiting to break. As the minutes passed, the mother could feel her frustration rising. She was determined to get to the bottom of this, to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. It wasn't just about getting a drink for her kids anymore. It was about standing up for herself, her children, and everyone who had ever been dismissed or treated unfairly. She knew that this wasn't a battle she could back down from, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone around her. The fight for dignity, respect, and equality wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was worth it. She stood up once again, this time more firmly than before. Something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just asking for water anymore. She was demanding respect. The moment the mother stood up, she knew things were about to escalate. Her heart raced in her chest, but her steps were steady. She wasn't going to let this go. She walked down the narrow aisle with purpose, ignoring the stares and whispers from the passengers around her. The discomfort in the air was palpable, but she was done letting it hold her back. The longer she stood in that seat, the more it felt like the injustice was swallowing her whole. Her kids deserved better, and so did she. As she reached the front, she noticed the senior flight attendant talking to a few other crew members in hushed tones. She could see them glance in her direction, their expressions unreadable. It was clear that they knew something was about to happen. The mother didn't hesitate this time. She approached the senior attendant directly. "I need to speak to you," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just about water anymore. The other attendant refused to give my children a basic drink. When I asked again, she dismissed me. And when I overheard her say, 'Not all requests are treated the same,' it became clear that something else is going on here." The senior flight attendant blinked, her face hardening for a brief second before quickly regaining her composure. She gave a slight nod, but there was no apology, no empathy in her response. "I'll speak with her," she said, her voice low but matter-of-fact. She turned toward the back of the plane, but the mother wasn't finished yet. "She should not have treated me like that," the mother said, her voice rising now, a mix of anger and disbelief. "This isn't just poor service. This is disrespect." The senior flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but then turned back to her, saying only, "Please take a seat." "I'll handle it." The mother didn't move. She wasn't about to be dismissed again. She had already tried to handle this quietly, but now the issue was too big to ignore. She could see the flight attendants whispering back and forth as they walked toward the back of the plane, clearly in discussion about what to do next. Meanwhile, the passengers were watching, some in silence, others clearly nervous about the confrontation. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, but again, no one spoke out. The mother turned back to her seat, still feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She looked at her children, still sitting quietly, unaware of the full extent of what was happening. They were just thirsty. She thought about all the times she had taught them to be patient, to be respectful. But now, she realized, this wasn't just about them asking for a drink. It was about showing them how to stand up for what's right. She could hear murmurs from behind her, passengers still gossiping in hushed tones, unsure of what to make of the situation. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the longer the flight attendant stayed in the back, the more the unease grew. She knew that whatever happened next, she was not going to sit back and let this moment pass. She was ready for it to be addressed. If she had to, she would take this further. But she wasn't about to let this woman get away with treating her family like they didn't matter. She had drawn a line in the sand. Minutes passed before the senior flight attendant returned to the front. She walked down the aisle with a look of quiet frustration, but there was something different in her eyes now. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about what had just happened. The air seemed to shift as she approached the mother. The flight attendant took a deep breath before speaking, her voice low but steady. "We've spoken to her. She's been removed from service for the rest of the flight." The mother stood there, not sure how to react. Part of her felt a sense of relief, but another part of her knew that this wasn't over. The situation had escalated too far, and the way it had been handled, or mishandled, still didn't sit right with her. The flight attendant had been dismissed, yes, but was that enough? Was it ever truly enough to fix the kind of treatment they had just experienced? The moment the senior flight attendant spoke, a wave of mixed emotions rushed over the mother. Part of her felt a sense of relief. The flight attendant who had been so dismissive was finally being held accountable. The mother's request for respect and fairness had been answered. She had stood her ground, and now she was seeing some results. But that sense of relief was short-lived. As the senior flight attendant walked away, a part of the mother couldn't help but wonder, is this really enough? She glanced at her children. They were still sitting quietly, staring out the window, completely unaware of the escalating drama unfolding around them. They had no idea what had just happened, how their simple request for water had turned into something much bigger. She was glad they hadn't had to see it all, but in the back of her mind, she felt an undeniable sense of sadness. This was the world they were growing up in, a world where something as simple as asking for a drink could turn into a moment of humiliation. A world where people who looked like her could be treated differently, even in public places, without reason. As the plane continued its journey, the cabin remained tense. The flight attendants were quiet now, moving around the plane with a careful, almost nervous energy. The other passengers were still whispering among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened, others trying to make sense of it all. There was no denying the weight of what had transpired. The air was thick with judgment, but not just judgment of the mother. It felt like judgment of the situation itself. No one wanted to admit what had just happened. They didn't want to confront the reality of what had taken place in front of them. But the mother didn't have the luxury of pretending that this was just a misunderstanding or bad service. She knew what she had heard. She knew the treatment she had received, and she knew the reason behind it. It wasn't just about being ignored. It wasn't just about water. It was something deeper, something that was impossible to ignore anymore. A few minutes later, the senior flight attendant returned to the mother's row. She didn't seem to have the same confidence she had earlier. Her face was slightly flushed, and there was a subtle tension in her posture. She stopped beside the mother's seat, her eyes flicking nervously from the mother to the kids. The senior attendant opened her mouth to speak, but for a moment, it seemed like she wasn't sure what to say. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "I just wanted to apologize for the earlier situation." Her voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "It was unacceptable, and we are taking the matter seriously. I've spoken to the crew and we're looking into it further. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior from any of our staff." The mother nodded, not fully convinced. She wasn't sure what she expected the flight attendant to say, but this wasn't enough. "Thank you," she said, but her tone was flat. The apology felt hollow. Looking into it further, that didn't change the fact that her children had been denied something as basic as water. That didn't change the fact that her request had been treated with disdain and prejudice. "Is she going to be removed from the flight entirely?" the mother asked, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't going to let the matter rest just because the flight attendant had apologized. The senior attendant hesitated for a moment. "She has been removed from active service for the remainder of the flight. She will not be serving passengers again," The mother thought about that for a second. It wasn't a punishment she felt was enough. The flight attendant had already done damage, and no matter how many apologies were given or how many investigations followed, it wouldn't change the way she had been treated. It wouldn't change the experience for her children. The mother glanced at her kids again, who were now drawing on the backs of the seats in front of them, happily lost in their own little world. They hadn't seen the tension, hadn't felt the sting of being treated like they didn't belong. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. The mother wasn't just angry anymore, she was heartbroken. Heartbroken that in a situation that should have been simple and straightforward, she was left questioning whether she and her children mattered. The senior flight attendant shifted on her feet, as though unsure of what else to say. "I understand this was a very difficult situation," she said quietly. "And I assure you, we'll be looking into it. I'll make sure the proper steps are taken." But the mother was already looking away, her thoughts elsewhere. She could feel the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on her. Even if the flight attendant had been removed, even if the situation was being looked into, what did that really mean? It felt like a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the damage had already been done. She had tried to address it calmly, to speak up, but the underlying problem wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or a brief removal from duty. There was something much bigger at play here. It wasn't just about water. It wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about something ingrained in the way society operated, something that many people didn't want to see. And though she knew this flight would eventually end and her family would move on, she couldn't help but feel like the real fight was only just beginning. The flight continued, but now it felt like more than just a journey through the air. It felt like a moment that would stay with her, a reminder of the way the world sometimes works, and how sometimes the hardest battles were the ones no one saw. As the plane finally began its descent toward New York, the mother found herself lost in thought, her mind swirling with everything that had just happened. The excitement of reaching her destination was overshadowed by the heaviness of what had unfolded. The cabin was quieter now, most passengers absorbed in their own worlds, staring out of windows or scrolling through their phones. But the atmosphere felt different to her. It wasn't just the silence. It was the lingering tension, the uncomfortable awareness of something unresolved. She had stood up for herself and her children, but she knew this was not the end of the story. Not for her, and not for the flight attendants who had been involved. She glanced at her kids, who were still oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. They were now pressing their faces against the window, watching the city skyline slowly come into view. For them, this flight was just another part of their day, a flight to a new place, another adventure. But for the mother, it had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a flight anymore. It had become a symbol of how far we still have to go when it comes to treating everyone with dignity and respect. The issue was bigger than her, bigger than this flight, bigger than one bad interaction. This was something systemic, something that, if left unchecked, would continue to happen to other families, to other people who would be treated less than for reasons they couldn't control. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, a quiet frustration bubbling up inside her. What would happen now? Would the flight attendants be held accountable? What kind of apology would follow? Would anyone even care that this incident had happened? Or would it all be swept under the rug once the plane landed, once the cabin doors opened, and everyone moved on with their lives? For the first time, she realized that these moments, the ones that went unnoticed by most, were the ones that defined a person's experience in the world. She wasn't naive. She knew that no apology would undo the feeling of being treated unfairly, of being made to feel like an outsider on a plane she had every right to be on. No apology could take back the sting of those words. Not all requests are treated the same. Those words would stay with her long after this flight ended, long after she returned to her regular routine. They were words that felt like a deep cut, an invisible wound that would only grow more apparent over time. She thought back to the senior flight attendant's apology, the one that had felt so hollow. There had been no real accountability in her words. No sense that what had happened was a violation, not just of her dignity, but of basic human decency. "We're looking into it," the attendant had said, but that felt empty, like a promise made without the intent to follow through. What did looking into it even mean? Would the airline do anything to ensure that nothing like this happened again? Would there be any real change in how staff members were trained to treat passengers? Or was this just another instance of a company trying to avoid conflict, trying to smooth things over without addressing the deeper issues that lay beneath the surface? Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the flight attendants came down the aisle, handing out landing cards and asking passengers to prepare for arrival. The attendant passed by without a glance in her direction, but the mother couldn't help but notice how quickly the woman moved, as though she was avoiding eye contact. She didn't know if it was intentional, or if it was just the flight attendant's way of keeping things professional, but to the mother, it felt like an attempt to brush the situation under the rug. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt signs clicked off, the cabin began to stir with movement. People were grabbing their bags from overhead compartments, preparing to disembark. The kids were excited now, pointing out the window as they saw the city stretching below them. For them, it was all just part of the adventure, another day in their world. But for the mother, everything felt different. She didn't want to get off the plane and forget about what had happened. She didn't want to just walk away as if nothing significant had occurred. She couldn't let this go. As the passengers filed out of the plane, she held back for a moment, letting everyone else go ahead. She didn't want to confront anyone else in the cabin. Not now, not when the situation had already reached its peak. But she felt a strong pull to do something, to say something to make sure this incident didn't fade into the background. She wasn't just going to walk away quietly. She approached the gate attendant who was standing by the door, greeting passengers as they exited the plane. The woman smiled, but the mother could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She could feel the tension still hanging in the air. The mother took a deep breath before speaking, her voice calm but firm. "I want to make sure that this is taken seriously," she said, keeping her gaze steady. "What happened on that plane wasn't just bad service. It was discrimination. I need to know that the airline will address this properly. I need to know that the staff will be held accountable for what they did, and that this won't happen to anyone else." The gate attendant looked at her, caught off guard. She paused for a moment before responding. "I understand," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "I'm sure the airline will follow up on this. If you'd like, I can give you the information for our customer service department." The mother nodded, though she wasn't sure how much more she could trust the process. She took the information the gate attendant offered and gave her a small nod before turning to leave the plane. As she walked down the jet bridge, the weight of the situation seemed to settle even more heavily on her shoulders. She had done all she could to stand up for herself and her children, but now, it felt like the real fight was just beginning. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew there would be resistance. But she also knew that her voice mattered. It mattered not just for her, but for everyone else who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. She couldn't walk away from this, not without making sure that her experience and the experiences of others were acknowledged. Because if no one spoke up, if no one challenged the status quo, nothing would change. And that, more than anything, was something she refused to accept. As she stepped into the terminal and found her family, she couldn't help but think that this moment, as difficult as it had been, had also been a reminder that the fight for fairness was ongoing, that standing up wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of that responsibility with a sense of purpose. As the family walked through the terminal, the excitement of reaching New York started to return. The kids were bouncing around, eager to get to their next adventure. They didn't know what had happened on the plane, and the mother was relieved for that. She didn't want them to see her in a state of frustration, her mind still caught in the web of everything that had unfolded. But inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deep had shifted in her. Something had been broken, Not just in that moment on the plane, but in the way she viewed the world. A world where things like this could happen without anyone really questioning them. She had tried to let it go, to push the incident to the back of her mind, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the situation had been dismissed too easily. The flight attendant had been removed from duty, yes, but what did that really mean? Was that enough? Would the airline actually take any meaningful steps to prevent something like this from happening again? Or would they simply wait for the storm to pass, hoping that the issue would fade as quickly as it had flared up? The mother walked ahead, the children skipping in front of her, but her thoughts kept circling back. She thought about the other passengers, the ones who had witnessed what had happened and said nothing. Some had looked uncomfortable, but no one had spoken up. And maybe that was what bothered her the most. The silence. People had seen something wrong, and yet no one had done anything to intervene. It wasn't that she expected people to stand up and take her side immediately, but the complete lack of action was telling. It was as if everyone had simply accepted the situation, as if they thought this was just how things were, and that made her even more determined to push forward. Her hand tightened around the handle of her suitcase as she made her way to the baggage claim area. The familiar hum of the airport felt distant to her now. People moved around her, their faces lost in the routine of travel, unaware of the underlying tension she carried. She knew that once they left the airport, life would return to normal, and this incident would likely fade from everyone else's mind. But she couldn't let it. Not this time. When they finally got to the baggage claim, the mother checked her phone, which had been buzzing with messages and missed calls. There were texts from friends asking how the flight went, if they had arrived safely. She hesitated before replying, unsure of how to explain what had happened. It wasn't something she could easily sum up in a short message. It wasn't something that could be brushed off with a simple, "Everything's fine." She typed out a brief response to her friend, telling them that the flight had been uncomfortable, that something had happened with a flight attendant, but leaving out the details for now. She wasn't ready to share the whole story yet. Not with friends who didn't understand, not with people who might minimize what had happened. She needed time to process it all, to find a way to make sense of the emotions that had taken over her. But part of her knew that she couldn't keep it to herself forever. It wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless others who had been made to feel less than, simply because of the color of their skin, the way they spoke, or the way they looked. The baggage carousel started to turn, and she grabbed the handle of her suitcase, trying to pull herself back into the present moment. The kids were already running ahead, thrilled to see their luggage appear. She couldn't help but smile at their energy, their excitement. It was a stark contrast to the heaviness she felt. They were so innocent, so unaware of the complexities of the world. Part of her wanted to shield them from it, to protect them from ever experiencing something like what had happened on the plane. But she knew she couldn't. The world they were growing up in wasn't perfect, and no amount of shielding could change that. The truth was, she didn't just want to protect them from experiences like this. She wanted to change the world they were growing up in. She wanted a world where this kind of discrimination, this kind of treatment, didn't happen. She wanted to raise her children in a world where people didn't have to fight for their basic dignity. But she knew that change didn't come easily. It came with discomfort, with difficult conversations, and with a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. She had faced that discomfort head-on on the plane, and now, standing in the baggage claim area, she realized that the fight wasn't over. It wasn't over just because she had been heard, just because the flight attendant had been removed from service. The real work was in making sure that things didn't go back to how they were before. The real work was in pushing for accountability, in demanding better, and in standing up every time something wrong happened, no matter how big or small. She was already making plans. She was going to follow up with the airline, make sure her complaint was heard and addressed. She wasn't going to let this slide, not when her children were learning from her example. She wanted them to see that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. And as she watched her kids laughing and pulling their suitcases, Her heart swelled with love for them. They were her reason for everything. They were the reason she had to keep fighting, keep pushing. She couldn't let them grow up in a world where they were taught to accept injustice as normal. She had to show them that they could make a difference, that their voices mattered, no matter how big or small they felt. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, and with it, a sense of resolve. This wasn't just about one flight or one flight attendant or one bad experience. This was about something bigger. This was about changing the narrative. And even if it felt like a long road ahead, she knew she couldn't stop now. As they left the airport and made their way into the bustling streets of New York, the mother couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, a purpose that had been born out of the injustice she had faced, and a purpose that would continue to drive her forward. The world may not be ready for change, but she was, and she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As they exited the airport, the mother felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The bright lights of New York City were welcoming, but her mind was still heavy with what had happened just hours earlier. The hustle and bustle of the city around her felt almost surreal in comparison to the tension she'd experienced on the plane. The noise of traffic, the honking cars, the chatter of people hurrying to their destinations. It all felt distant, like she was stepping out of one world and into another. But even though the city was alive and vibrant, her thoughts kept pulling her back to that moment in the sky. That moment when she had felt so small and powerless in the face of injustice. Her kids were happy, bouncing between the sidewalks and pointing out the landmarks they recognized. They had no idea what had happened, and she was grateful for that. She didn't want to burden them with the weight of what they had just gone through. For now, they were happy, and that was enough. But as much as she wanted to enjoy the city with them, her thoughts kept drifting back to the incident. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. The situation hadn't just been about a rude flight attendant or bad service. It had been about something deeper, something more insidious, a casual, almost invisible form of discrimination that she had been made to endure simply because of who she was. She tried to push the anger aside. There were more important things to focus on now: her kids, their trip, the excitement of being in the city. But no matter how hard she tried, it lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't let it go. She kept replaying the moment when she had overheard the flight attendant's words. Not all requests are treated the same. Every time she thought of them, it felt like a sharp sting. That comment wasn't just a passing remark. It was a statement, an underlying truth that she couldn't ignore. She had heard it before, in different forms, from different people. The assumption that some people were more deserving of kindness, more deserving of respect, more deserving of basic dignity. It wasn't just about water. It was about how people like her were too often treated like an afterthought. The more she thought about it, the more it angered her that this kind of treatment had been so easily brushed aside, that the flight attendants had been allowed to act with such indifference. She had expected them to do their jobs, yes, but she had also expected them to show basic humanity, and they had failed in that. But then something else occurred to her, something that shifted her perspective slightly. She thought about the other passengers on the plane. No one had spoken up. Not one person had stood up for her. Not one person had said, "This isn't right." At first, she had been disappointed by their silence, but now, as she walked through the streets of the city, she began to understand why. People don't always speak out. They don't always act, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how. It's easy to remain silent in uncomfortable situations, especially when it feels like it's easier to just let things go. But silence, she realized, was part of the problem. People who witnessed something wrong and said nothing contributed to the perpetuation of that wrong. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Maybe they were afraid of making things worse. Or maybe they just didn't recognize what was happening. But it didn't matter. Silence only allowed injustice to persist. And that's why she couldn't be silent. She couldn't let this moment pass without speaking out, without demanding accountability. Because the more people remained silent, the more these small injustices, the ones that seem insignificant at the time, build up until they become too large to ignore. Her resolve grew stronger as they made their way through the city. The more she thought about the silence of the passengers, the more determined she became to make sure her voice was heard. It wasn't just about this one incident anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been in her position, everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, everyone who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their requests didn't matter. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let it be forgotten. Her children continued to laugh and play, unaware of the storm still brewing inside their mother. They were so innocent, so full of life, and that made the weight of the situation hit her even harder. She didn't want them to face this kind of treatment. She didn't want them to have to grow up in a world where they were forced to fight for their dignity, but she knew deep down that she couldn't protect them from everything. What she could do, however, was equip them with the tools to recognize injustice when they saw it, and the courage to speak out against it. As they approached the hotel, the mother took a deep breath. For the first time in hours, she felt the weight of the moment begin to lift, just a little. The hotel lobby was bustling with people checking in and out, tourists excited to explore the city. The kids were jumping up and down, eager to get to their room and start their adventure. She forced a smile and joined in their excitement. They were in New York, after all, a place filled with possibility, a place where dreams could come true. But even as she smiled and followed her children to the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something bigger than herself. The battle for fairness, for equality, for respect. It wasn't something that could be won overnight. But she was ready for it. She was ready to fight, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. Even when it felt like the whole world was looking the other way. The work ahead of her was daunting, but it was necessary. And she knew as she watched her children's excitement unfold, that this fight was worth it. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for them, for their future, for a world where no one had to endure the same kind of treatment she had faced. As they entered the elevator, the doors closed behind them, and for the first time that day, she felt a small sense of peace. The city outside was bustling with energy, full of life and endless possibilities. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but she wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had a purpose now, one that would carry her forward through every challenge, every moment of uncertainty. She would keep fighting. And as long as she had the strength, she would make sure her voice, their voices, would never be silenced again. The next few days in New York passed in a blur of sightseeing, excitement, and a strange undercurrent of reflection. The city, full of life and energy, was a stark contrast to the weight the mother still carried from the flight. Her children were thrilled, soaking in every moment, the towering skyscrapers, the bright lights of Times Square, the rush of people in every direction. For them, it was a dream come true, but for her it was hard to shake the feeling that something had been lost along the way. She watched them, smiling and carefree, and thought about how easily they navigated the world around them. They didn't yet know the weight of the world on their shoulders, but one day they would. She couldn't stop thinking about the flight, about how something so simple, asking for water, had turned into a reminder of the realities they faced. She tried to push it out of her mind. She tried to focus on the present, to let her children enjoy the city they had dreamed of visiting. But the truth was, the incident on the plane had left a mark, not just on her, but on the way she viewed everything that followed. She couldn't stop wondering how many people, how many families, faced the same kind of treatment every day without anyone ever speaking up. The day after they arrived, she found herself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, staring out the large windows that overlooked the busy streets below. The city outside was as fast-paced as ever, but here, in this small space, everything felt still. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the airline's website. Her mind was set. She would follow up. She had to. She couldn't just let it go. If nothing else, she owed it to her children. They needed to know that the world wasn't always fair, but that didn't mean they couldn't fight for what was right. They needed to understand that their voice, no matter how small, could make a difference. And she needed to set an example for them, one that wasn't just about accepting things as they were, but about challenging them when they were wrong. She took a deep breath and began typing out an email to the airline's customer service department. She recounted the events of the flight, from the initial request for water to the dismissive response from the flight attendant to the overheard comment that made everything so much worse. She described how in that moment she had felt invisible, as if her request, her needs, didn't matter simply because of who she was. She explained how, when she spoke up, she wasn't just fighting for water but for her dignity, for her right to be treated with respect. As she typed, she felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just writing an email to complain. She was putting her experience, her pain, into words. She was turning the silent injustice into something tangible, something that couldn't be ignored. She wrote with care, with purpose, but also with a sense of vulnerability. She knew that the airline might not take her complaint seriously. She knew that they might brush it off or offer a generic apology. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had taken action. She had raised her voice, and she would continue to do so, no matter the outcome. Before hitting send, she paused and read the email over once more. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing everything she had felt during that flight. It was as if, by writing it down, she was finally releasing the tension that had been building inside her for days. She thought about how many people had been in her shoes, how many people had felt this same sting of being overlooked, of being treated as if they didn't matter. She wasn't the only one, and that made her realize how important it was to keep speaking out. If people didn't speak up, nothing would change. Finally, she pressed send. The moment the email was sent, a sense of calm settled over her. It wasn't a solution, and it certainly wasn't closure, but it was a step forward. She could finally breathe again, knowing she had done what she could. And as she looked at her phone, her mind wandered to the future. What would happen next? Would the airline respond? Would they take her seriously? And more importantly, would it matter? Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the laughter of her children approaching. They were coming back from the nearby park, tired but happy after a long day of running around. She smiled, watching them, and for the first time in days she felt a little lighter. The weight on her shoulders wasn't gone, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been. They were having fun, and that mattered. She was showing them, in her own way, how to fight for what's right. But she was also showing them how to live in the moment, how to find joy even when the world didn't seem fair. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, the mother found herself sitting by the window in their hotel room, looking out at the lights of the city. It was quieter now, the streets below less crowded, but the city never truly slept. As she stared out at the skyline, she felt a quiet sense of determination settle in her chest. This wasn't just about one flight, one incident. This was about something bigger. It was about making sure that people like her, people who had been marginalized and overlooked, had a seat at the table. It was about ensuring that the world didn't just listen when they spoke, but respected them, acknowledged them, and treated them as equals. And maybe, just maybe, this email was a small part of that change. Maybe the airline would take action. Maybe they wouldn't. But that wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that she had stood up for herself, for her family, and for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than. She was raising her voice, and that was the most important thing. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a passenger on a flight anymore. She was a part of something larger, something that needed to be spoken about, that needed to be addressed. And with that, she realized something profound. This journey wasn't just about traveling to a new city. It was about starting a new chapter, one where she and her children would no longer accept the world as it was. They would challenge it, they would question it, and they would fight for the kind of world they wanted to live in. A world where no one would ever again feel like they didn't belong. The next few days in New York came and went in a blur of activity. The mother tried to focus on making the most of the trip, to enjoy the moments that were meant to be joyful. Her kids were ecstatic about every corner of the city. The playgrounds, the pizza, the subway rides that felt like an adventure. They didn't know the heaviness their mother still carried, the quiet storm that lingered in her mind after what had happened on the flight. They were happy, lost in the magic of the city, and that made her smile, even though she felt like there was something unresolved within her. She had sent the email to the airline, and a part of her hoped it would be enough to spark change. But another part of her feared it might just be swallowed up in the bureaucracy of customer service, one of many complaints lost in a sea of others. The response, or lack of one, was something she couldn't control. But that didn't mean she would let go of the fight. She'd raised her voice, and no matter what came next, she knew she couldn't turn back. The days passed, and she kept her focus on the kids. She watched them run through the streets of Manhattan, filled with wonder at everything they saw, from the towering skyscrapers to the famous landmarks like the Empire State Building in Central Park. They were having the time of their lives, and that joy was contagious. Every now and then she would catch a glimpse of their innocent excitement and feel a pang of sadness. She wanted to protect them from the world, from the unfairness she had faced, from the hard truths about how people of color, like her, were sometimes treated. But she knew that she couldn't shield them forever. She could only teach them to be strong, to stand tall, and to demand the respect they deserved. One afternoon, as they strolled through the busy streets near Times Square, the mother's phone buzzed with a new email notification. She had been expecting something, a response from the airline perhaps. She opened the email, her fingers trembling slightly as she read it. It was from the customer service team of the airline, and for a moment, her heart sank. She wasn't sure what kind of response she would get, but she steeled herself for disappointment. The email was polite, almost too polite. They thanked her for reaching out and acknowledged the situation, assuring her that they took her complaint seriously. They stated that the flight attendant in question had been removed from service, and that an internal investigation was underway. They also assured her that the airline was committed to providing a safe, welcoming experience for all passengers, regardless of race or background. The email ended with a vague apology and an invitation for her to provide any further details if she felt it was necessary. At first, she felt a flicker of relief. They had responded, but as she read through the email again, something gnawed at her. The apology felt empty. The language was carefully crafted, designed to reassure her without truly addressing the core of the issue. Yes, they had removed the flight attendant from service, but what about the underlying problem? What about the culture that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place? What about the silence of the other passengers, the indifference of those around her? She closed the email and stared at the screen, a sense of frustration building inside her. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. She knew that the issue at hand went far beyond one flight attendant's actions. It wasn't just about an isolated incident. It was about a system that allowed these kinds of injustices to happen repeatedly, to people who were constantly overlooked or mistreated. And that was something the airline hadn't even begun to address. Removing one flight attendant didn't change the deeper, more pervasive issue that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. She felt a mix of anger and disappointment. The email, while polite and courteous, was ultimately a way to smooth things over without confronting the real problem. It didn't speak to the larger issues of bias, inequality, or discrimination that she had experienced, and that many others had experienced before her. It didn't acknowledge that this wasn't just about a single person's mistake, but about a larger pattern that needed to be broken. The mother sighed, feeling the weight of it all again. She wasn't satisfied with this response, and she couldn't just accept it as an answer. As her children continued to marvel at the lights and sounds around them, she stood still for a moment, letting the reality of the situation settle in. She knew she couldn't let this go. This was bigger than one flight, one incident, one complaint. It was about all the times that people had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated because of who they were. She wasn't going to let her story, or the stories of others like her, be brushed under the rug. She took a deep breath and started typing a response. She wasn't angry, but her words were deliberate, sharp. She didn't want to come across as hostile, but she needed to be clear. She needed them to understand that this wasn't just about a bad experience on a flight. This was about acknowledging the deeper issue of racial bias, of systemic discrimination, and of the culture that allowed these things to happen. In her response, she thanked them for their email, but she made it clear that their actions thus far had not been enough. She asked what concrete steps the airline was taking to address the issue of racial discrimination on their flights. She demanded transparency, not just in how they handled her complaint, but in how they were addressing the broader issue of inequality. She wanted to know if the airline was implementing real training for their staff, if they were educating their employees on bias, if they were taking any meaningful steps to ensure that nothing like this would happen again. She wanted to know what the airline was doing to actively change the culture, not just patch up one incident with a temporary fix. As she typed, the words seemed to flow more easily. She wasn't just writing a complaint anymore. She was demanding action. And for the first time in days, she felt like she was truly doing something about the injustice she had faced. She wasn't just letting it slide. She was pushing back. She was making them see that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible or unworthy. When she finished, she hit send without hesitation. There was no going back now. The email would be sent into the ether, but she knew she had done everything she could to make her voice heard. She had taken the next step in her fight for respect, for equality, for her children's future. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't an email. It was a message from her best friend asking how the trip was going. She smiled for a moment, then typed a quick response. "It's going well. I'm making it count." She put her phone away and caught up with her children, who were calling her to come see the lights of Times Square. They were happy, completely caught up in the wonder of the city, and for a moment as she joined them, she let herself feel that sense of wonder too. The world was big, and she was just one person, but today she knew she had taken a stand, and tomorrow she would continue fighting. The journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the days in New York passed, the mother felt both a deep sense of satisfaction and an ever-present weight on her shoulders. The kids had thoroughly enjoyed themselves, and they'd made some incredible memories, from riding the Staten Island ferry to watching a Broadway show. They didn't seem to notice the emotional journey their mother was on, and for that, she was grateful. They were still young, still full of innocent wonder, and she didn't want to spoil that by dragging them into the complexities of the world just yet. But the fact was, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened on that plane, what she had experienced, and what had yet to unfold. She had sent her follow-up email to the airline, and as she waited for a response, a part of her wondered if it would be any different from the first. The initial response had been polite and dismissive. It was what she had expected from a company that had likely handled countless complaints in the same way, but this time she wasn't backing down. She wasn't letting them off the hook with a vague apology and a promise to look into it. She needed more. She deserved more. The silence of the past few days felt louder than ever, and it pushed her to keep pushing forward. One morning she took the kids to Central Park, allowing herself to lose herself in the moment. They ran around on the grass, playing and laughing as the sun peeked through the towering trees. She watched them, smiling, but her mind still wandered. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the beauty of the park or the joy of the day. It was that she couldn't help but reflect on how much more there was to be done. How many more stories were out there like hers? How many more people were suffering silently, just like she had on that plane? A part of her wanted to retreat, to simply enjoy her time with her kids and forget the weight of everything that had happened. But she knew deep down that she couldn't. The truth was that her experience wasn't unique. It was part of a larger, unspoken pattern. A pattern that didn't just exist in airports or on planes, but in every corner of society, in workplaces, schools, and even in everyday interactions. The quiet, invisible ways people of color were made to feel less than, diminished, overlooked. It wasn't always blatant. Often it was subtle. It wasn't always something that could be immediately called out. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface, shaping experiences, shaping lives. She couldn't just sit back and accept it. The thought of letting it slide, of walking away without demanding more from the airline, gnawed at her. The fight wasn't just about one flight attendant. It wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for everyone who had been ignored, dismissed, or disrespected. It was about forcing the world to look at the things they'd turned a blind eye to for too long. But how could she bring about change? Was it enough to send emails, to ask for accountability from a corporation that likely viewed her complaint as just another case to close? The question lingered in her mind. She needed to do something more than just send words into the ether. She needed to make sure this wasn't just a one-off moment of indignation. This needed to be part of something bigger, a movement that said, enough. A movement that wasn't satisfied with words and apologies, but with real, lasting change. That evening, after the kids had fallen asleep, the mother sat at the small desk in their hotel room, once again facing her phone and laptop. She pulled up the airline's website, checking her inbox once more. There it was, a new email from the customer service team. Her heart raced slightly as she clicked open the message. The email was brief, but this time, there was a noticeable difference. The airline had apologized again, this time more sincerely. They mentioned that they had reviewed her complaint in detail, and they were taking appropriate internal actions to prevent similar situations in the future. They acknowledged the seriousness of her concerns regarding discrimination, and promised that they were committed to training their staff on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They even mentioned that they were working on new procedures to ensure that their passengers felt safe and respected. While she appreciated the more sincere tone of the response, it still felt insufficient. Words were one thing, but actions were another. She had heard similar promises before, from other institutions, from other companies. It was easy to say you were committed to change. It was much harder to actually make that change happen. She couldn't help but wonder if this was just another attempt to placate her, to end the issue quietly before it could snowball into something bigger. She stared at the screen, feeling a sense of frustration creeping back in. The response, while more polished, still didn't answer her bigger questions. How exactly would the airline ensure that their staff was better trained? What tangible steps were they taking to address the deeper issue of racial bias? Was this just about a few more workshops for their employees? Or were they truly willing to change the way they approached customer service, the way they saw and treated people of different backgrounds? After a moment of thought, she clicked the reply button. This time her response was measured but firm. She thanked them for their apology, but made it clear that she needed to know more. She wanted specifics. She wanted to know what real steps they were taking beyond simply offering diversity training. She asked for transparency in the process and expressed that she would be following up again. She told them that this issue wasn't just about one isolated incident. It was about a long history of systemic issues that needed to be confronted head-on. She knew this might not lead to immediate results, but she wasn't about to let the conversation end here. When she hit send, it felt like a weight had lifted, but it also felt like the beginning of something. The airline had responded, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day, as she watched her children play in the park once again, the mother felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know where this would lead, but she knew that she was no longer just a passenger in this fight. She was a participant, and she was ready to keep pushing to make sure her voice was heard, to ensure that this wasn't just one story among many. This was a turning point. It had to be. She didn't just want things to be different for her children. She wanted things to be different for everyone. She was ready to be part of the change no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult it became. She had a voice, and now she was going to make sure it was heard. Because the truth was, no matter how small the act, every action mattered. And as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, she realized that this was just the beginning. The fight for equality, for justice, for respect. It wasn't a battle that could be fought in one moment or with one email. It was something that had to be fought every day by every person who refused to accept the status quo, and she would be one of those people. The final days of their trip were filled with a sense of quiet resolve. The kids, still brimming with excitement, had no idea about the emotional journey their mother had been on. They were wrapped up in the wonder of the city. Their laughter echoed through Central Park as they explored, their eyes wide with the joy of seeing the world through fresh eyes. For the mother, there was a certain peace in watching them. It reminded her why she had to fight. She wasn't just fighting for herself or for justice in a single moment. She was fighting for them, for their future, for a world that was fairer and more compassionate than the one she had experienced. The email exchanges with the airline were ongoing, and as expected, the responses were polite, reassuring, and full of the right corporate language. But every time she read them, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real change she was asking for wasn't happening fast enough. She knew these emails were just the beginning of a much larger process, one that would require more than just words to be effective. It would require action, accountability, and an openness to truly understanding and confronting the systems that perpetuate racial inequality. The mother wasn't naive enough to think that change would happen overnight. She knew this journey would take time, maybe even years. But what mattered most was that the conversation had started. She had sparked something. She had raised her voice in a way that couldn't be ignored. And that, she realized, was the first step toward lasting change. The night before they left New York, she stood by the window of their hotel room, looking out over the city. The lights of the skyline twinkled against the deep blue sky, each one representing a story, a person, a dream. She thought about all the times she had been made to feel small, all the moments in her life when she had been treated differently because of her skin color. But tonight, there was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet sense of determination. She had fought for what was right, and now it was time to take that fight back home with her. The world wasn't going to change in a day, but she had learned something invaluable on this journey. Change starts with one person, one voice, one story at a time. She had started with hers, and as long as she had the strength, she would keep speaking up, for herself and for others who didn't have the platform or the opportunity to do so. She glanced at her children, who were already asleep in their beds, their faces relaxed in the innocence of youth. She felt a deep, overwhelming love for them, but also a sense of responsibility. She was their guide, their protector, and that meant showing them not just how to navigate the world as it was, but how to fight for the world they wanted to see, one where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of who they were, what they looked like, or where they came from. The next morning, as they made their way to the airport for their flight home, she felt a quiet peace. The trip had been unforgettable, not just because of the iconic landmarks they had visited, but because it had been the backdrop for a journey that was much more personal. She had learned to find her voice in a way she never had before, and she had made sure that her children would grow up knowing the value of standing up for what was right. They might not have understood the gravity of the situation yet, but she was laying the foundation for them to become people who wouldn't stand by in silence when injustice was happening. They would grow up knowing that the world could be different, and that they too could help make it better. As she boarded the flight back home, she thought about the future. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, and moments where she questioned if anything would truly change. But she also knew that every small action, every word spoken, every conversation started, contributed to the shift that was happening. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and she would continue to be a part of that change. As the plane ascended into the sky, she looked out the window and took a deep breath. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as long as she had the courage to keep fighting, there would always be hope for a better tomorrow. If you found this story interesting, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.